Bem-vindos aqueles que estão nos assistindo online. Eu vou passar a apresentação do professor Stephan Kirste. Stephan Kirste realizou seu doutorado em Freiburg e a habilitação, que corresponde mais ou menos ao que nós chamamos no Brasil de livre docência, em Heidelberg. Foi professor numa universidade cujo nome esqueci, na Hungria, mas atualmente é o professor titular de Filosofia do Direito da Universidade de Salzburg, na Áustria. Ele foi presidente da seção alemã da IBR durante muito tempo. É um dos editores da Enciclopédia de Filosofia do Direito e Filosofia Social da IBR. Publicou vários livros, inclusive uma excelente introdução à filosofia do direito, publicada no Brasil pela De Plácido. E é o único brasileiro que não fala, é o único brasileiro que não sabe falar português, mas entende tudo. Já tem 20 anos que o professor Stephan Kirste vem com muita frequência ao Brasil e disse uma vez, se eu não me engano era o Hesse, dizia, ou Heller, que dizia que a coisa mais importante para um constitucionalista alemão era vir ao Brasil. O professor Stephan Kirste é um brasileiro. Bem-vindo.
Bom dia. Good morning. Thank you very much for the honorable invitation to open this Congress. It's always a pleasure to travel to Brazil, and after such a long intermission because of the pandemic, this time it is a special pleasure to do so. In the following roughly 30 minutes, I'm going to present to you some ideas about the concept of the Republic, which supposedly is also the general topic of this conference. I take the principle of the Republic as an umbrella concept that is able to encompass different aspects of modern democratic states under the rule of law. So it's an umbrella concept encompassing the rule of law, democracy, and other aspects of our modern constitutional democracy. Now, the concept of the Republic does not come without dangers. Dangers can be a collectivist conception of the Republic on the one side, or an over-individualistic conception of the Republic. And when I introduce the second term of the title, Humanism, this is exactly meant to avoid some of the problems of the principle of the Republic. Now, let me begin with a quote by the German philosopher, Marxist philosopher, but also humanist philosopher Ernst Bloch. He speaks of a humanism in action. He calls for a humanism in action. And he explains, and this is the quote I'm going to read, what he means by this. To this humanism in action belongs the question of the real intentions of the old natural law. Belongs the abandonment of a socialist inheritance to these formerly liberal, but only liberal human, not only liberal human rights. And now comes a very important term in this quotation: the establishment of an upright walk, even against padded, even against rebaptized, even retrograde dependencies. They are postulates from natural law, and nowhere else even findable. So Ernst Bloch calls for a particular concept of humanism as the basis of the Republic. He also speaks of the humanist primacy of the Republic. And in the end of this quote, he says, there is little human dignity without an end to misery, as there is human happiness without an end to old or new servitude. So his conception tries to avoid both servitude and misery. And he wants to do this by enabling human beings to walk upright in legal sense. And what I'm going to elaborate here is what it means in a legal perspective for a human being to have an upright walk, to be acknowledged, to be recognized as a being that has an upright walk. Now, the overall topic will then be, what does humanism contribute to the long theory of republicanism? You may know that even Cicero, I'm sure you pronounce it differently in Brazil, the Roman politician and philosopher Cicero spoke of a republic as the ideal form of a political commonwealth. And it is quite remarkable that many humanists in antiquity, but also in Renaissance and in modern times, applied the concept of the republic. So let's, in a first step, look at the concept. So this will be the steps of my presentation. I begin with the definition of republicanism, not very original. Then I turn to the rediscovery of human dignity by Renaissance Republican philosophers, and then ask what impact does humanism have on the concept of the republic. So this will be my general outline, and I'm going to finish with a short summary. So let us look at republicanism first. If I observe it correctly, the concept of republicanism is receiving a renaissance. Many scholars around the world these days again talk about the principle of republicanism as an alternative of some shortfalls of liberal conceptions on the one side and collectivist conception of the Commonwealth on the other side. Now, what does republicanism mean? What is the principle of republicanism? And here, I'm not, as I said before, I'm not very original. I more or less refer to other scholars here, especially Philip Pettit and Frank Lovett, two American scholars who identified four principles, more or less four principles by which, a republicanism can be defined. First, the republican freedom. Second, the rule of law. Thirdly, participation of the citizens in the foundation of the state. And fourth, and I think this is a prominently distinguishing feature between republican conceptions and democratic conceptions, the concept of the common good. So now let's look at it some more closely. First, Republican freedom. If we speak of the concept of freedom, we can distinguish two dimensions of freedom. One dimension is positive freedom. Positive freedom signifying the freedom towards something, towards the realization of ourselves, towards the development of our abilities. And quite distinct from this concept of positive freedom is the concept of negative freedom. You could call it the freedom to be left alone, the freedom from the state, which is directed against the state. The state should leave my private sphere for myself and not intervene.
Stephan, can you interrupt for a minute?
Yes, sure.
We had a little problem, tecnológico
Yeah,
problem.
don't worry.
A sala de tradução está vazia.
Tem que aceitar. Mas ela tem na sala da Marcelo, avisa o pessoal. Avisa o pessoal aqui na conversa. Se puder avisar o pessoal. É 20 minutos falando. Quem tá na internet não viu. Viu o quê? Porque nós temos erros.
Vamos reiniciar. Para quem está nos assistindo online, nós tivemos um problema técnico aqui com a tradução. Acho que todos estão sabendo que tem um sistema de tradução, mas a maioria das pessoas não conseguiam antes entrar na sala e por isso não estavam tendo acesso à tradução. O professor Stephan Kirste, então, vai retomar rapidamente e recomeçar. Obrigado.
Okay. I try again, and it seems to be that what I said before was kind of a silent movie from the early 20s to you from the last century, so I repeat myself. Maybe this helps. Okay, I started quoting Ernst Bloch, Marxist humanist from the 20th century, who had in fact to flee East Germany, the communist East Germany, and moved to Tübingen, southern Western Germany. And he had the idea that humanism means enabling people to an upright walk. Now, what does this upright walk mean? It means the protection of the dignity and protection from misery, from servitude, to enable us all to stand upright. This was his idea of dignity, and he wanted to introduce this by means of humanism in action into the concept of the Republic. In my presentation, the silent presentation for you, I came to the point where I wanted to get an outline, and I wanted to come to the point, what is Republican? And I follow here American scholars, namely Philip Pettit and Frank Lovett, by identifying 4 principles as characteristic for a theory of republicanism. First principle is a certain conception of freedom. Second, or liberty. Second is the principle of the rule of law, or as we say in German, the principle of the legal state. Thirdly, participation of all people in public affairs, in affairs that concern us all. And fourthly, the principle of the common good, which is in a way the most distinguishing principle between Republican theories and liberal theories. And before our short interruption, I wanted to begin with a discussion of the first principle, namely the principle of freedom. What does freedom mean? And what I was saying was, I tried to distinguish between 2 dimensions of freedom. First, the positive freedom, the freedom to something, to develop our abilities, to unfold our virtues, to work for the common good. And this is quite distinct from the second dimension of freedom, namely negative freedom. A freedom that you could call the freedom to be left alone, the freedom from the state. So this leaves a private sphere for all of us, for all citizens. And of course, the big question is, how do the 2 relate to each other? Whereas in a liberal conception, negative freedom is the only concept of freedom. As Benjamin Constant put it, there is only negative modern freedom. Positive freedom is the freedom of the ancient. Positive freedom is collectivist. But this is based on the presupposition that we have kind of a natural freedom. We are born free. This may be indeed, and probably it is the case. But real freedom depends on the recognition of our freedom by others. It is socially, at least embedded, freedom. I come to this later. So what I'm going to establish is a connection between positive and negative freedom without falling prey to the mistakes ancient concepts of freedom have made with respect to positive freedom as collective. The second principle of republicanism is the principle of the rule of law, or as we in the continental tradition would say, the principle of the legal state. There are differences between the principle of the rule of law and the principle of the legal state. I'm not going into this here. But it is quite clear that a good republic has to be based on laws. Public authority needs this legal structure to be rational, to be impartial, and to serve the interests of the people. So a good republic, a well-ordered republic, needs law, needs especially the Constitution. But what does the principle of the rule of law mean to individual freedom? Is the rule of law only the protection of our natural liberties? Or isn't this a reductionist perspective on the rule of law? What laws? Laws given to us by benevolent leaders? Or shouldn't the law be, the Constitution be an expression of our self-determination? This will be a question to be addressed later. But it leads also to the third principle. The third principle is the principle of participation. Now, from the beginning, from ancient philosophies on, the Republican principle was connected to the principle of participation. The individual, the citizen, was seen as someone who could, in an Aristotelian way, who can only develop himself if working for the Republic. We are human beings, so the classical conception of participation. We are, can you still listen? Okay. You are only a human being if you work for the Republic. So this is the third principle, participation. But how does participation refer to freedom, and how does it refer to the rule of law? I'm going to come to this later. And finally, the fourth principle is the principle of the common good. If you think of Adam Smith, if you think of John Stuart Mill, if you think of Mandeville, the bee fable, the Enlightenment liberal conception of the common good is that the common good is something we don't want to achieve, but it's being achieved behind our backs. How to make virtue out of vices. It would, according to the liberal concept, it would suffice if we are rational egoists, pursuing our interests. And if everybody pursues his interests, then the common good will result from this. Republicans are skeptical about this mechanism and more optimistic that we can work for the common good, that the common good can be a goal for our action. So these, in a very rough sketch, are 4 identifying principles for republicanism, 4 principles that distinguish a Republican from a liberal theory of the common good. Now the big question is, of course, if I want to relate republicanism and humanism, what does humanism contribute to this discussion? So let's now turn to humanism. And I jump in the history of legal philosophy, I jump right in to Renaissance time. And there's a debate, you once published a book about this, whether human dignity as a core principle of humanism was discovered by Renaissance humanists or rediscovered. Because the patristic philosophers and the classical Roman philosophers had some notion similar to the ideas of Renaissance Republicans, some notion of the principle of human dignity. But it's quite remarkable that, especially in northern Italy, beginning with the 15th century down to the 16th century, when you could observe these state republics, these small republics, now mostly cities, that were fighting each other for dominance, that during this very dangerous times for citizens, suddenly the concept of dignity, human dignity, came up and was intensely discussed. Intensely discussed in connection with the Republican principles. And now, during that time, you can identify two lines of argument about human dignity. One is an Aristotelian conception of dignity. The other one is a Platonist conception of human dignity. And in the end of this part of my presentation, I'm going to mediate the two. But first, what does distinguish an Aristotelian from a Platonistic concept of human dignity? Well, the Aristotelians considered dignity as to be social recognition, to be a social honor. And it is quite clear if we look at Coluccio Salutati, Matteo Palmieri, and others, that they conceptualized the citizen, the human being, as centrally social human beings. We are what we can be because we live in a republic, because we live in a social commonwealth. And this social commonwealth allows us to develop our ability. You know, as a legal philosopher, I can act quite strangely. I can talk to myself. But admittedly, it's much more fun to stand here, talk to you in presence, look into your eyes and realize, well, what I'm saying provokes a reaction, understanding, estrangement, criticism. So this way, even though I'm talking now, we have kind of a social relationship, a relationship of mutual recognition. Because if you go like this, I definitely should change my speech if I want your recognition. And if you go like this, I'll be happy. So whenever human beings meet, we have kind of interaction that ultimately lead to the recognition of our social status, of our position in society. But this raises the question, are we only the result of social recognition? Is the standing of the individual in society only the result of his achievements? And I think this is the problem for the Aristotelian conceptions of human dignity. How about handicapped, impaired people, for example? What if a society like in National Socialism, like in fascist regimes, yesterday we talked about fascism here in the same hall, don't want to recognize minorities. People belonging to these minorities, human beings belonging to these minorities have a right to be recognized. So on the one hand, we have this Aristotelian constructivist conception of human dignity. Dignity is the respect we owe each other in society. But to whom am I obliged to owe respect? Whom should I recognize? Only persons who are privileged enough to travel, who are endowed with some intelligence to formulate themselves? Or shouldn't all human beings, qua human beings, have a right to a certain respect? And this is where Platonism comes in. The Platonist philosophers of the Renaissance had the idea that we are incomplete. All of us are incomplete. And because of our incompleteness, we have to develop during our lives. And they had the wonderful image that a human being is like a chameleon that adapts to its surrounding and always changes, always develops new facets. And this is core to the human being. A philosopher, a wonderful philosopher, Pico della Mirandola, who tried to, in an encyclopedia, as Marcelo and I tried to do, to include all knowledge that was there in Renaissance time into an encyclopedia. And he wrote an introduction to this encyclopedia. And he called this introduction Oratio de Dignitate Homini, speech about the dignity of man. And in this wonderful introduction, he develops a nice picture that God speaks to Adam. And Adam asks God, who am I? What am I? What is my dignity? And God tells him, Adam, you are the architect and master of yourself. Now this is fascinating. We may not subscribe to the Christian background in a secular society, but the notion is interesting. You are the architect and the master of yourself. You are the only being in the world who has to be the one he wants to be, he or she wants to be. In a way, you are nothing if you don't make yourself something. And this is what you are. One could speak of a nice contradiction. You are nothing if you don't make yourself something. So I think in Pico della Mirandola, this image, this picture of the incomplete human being that necessarily has to make herself the ones he or she wants to be, mediates between a Platonic ontological conception and a constructivist conception of human dignity. We all are beings that have to make ourselves the ones we want to be. Now, this is interesting for the principles of republicanism. Because, first of all, the question of positive freedom. What does this dignity mean for the concept of positive freedom? We are the ones who can be
the kind of human being we want to be. We have to shape ourselves. We have to form ourselves. We have to determine ourselves. Positive freedom. And no one may hinder us to be the ones we want to be. No infringement of this freedom. Negative freedom. So human dignity then is the source of both positive and negative freedom. And both are necessary. Whereas modern Republicans who refrain from the idea of positive freedom have difficulties explaining or answering the question, freedom of what? Negative freedom from what? Okay, but of what? What is to be protected against state influence, against the use of state power, against state dominion? What is it? We, as human beings, can and should make ourselves the ones we want to be. So if you have this concept of human dignity, like Pico developed it, you have a source, a foundation for both negative and positive freedom. And if we now quickly introduce this to the concept of the Republic.